Chapter 1. The palace of Urkhal greeted Thea with the scent of fresh wax and cold stone. She followed the housekeeper through a narrow servants' corridor, trying to memorize every turn and counting the doors they passed. 3 weeks ago, she had buried her mother in their home village. Now, she was carrying a basket of linens across the stone floors of a royal residence, as though her entire former life had been left somewhere behind her, severed by a single turn of fate. "You'll be working in the West Wing," the housekeeper said without looking back. Her name was Hilda. "The royal chambers, the small dining room, the library. Be careful with the porcelain. The last girl broke a vase and lost a month's wages." Thea nodded, even though Hilda couldn't see her. The housekeeper sounded tired rather than cruel, which was somewhat reassuring. During the months she had spent wandering after her mother's death, Thea had learned to judge people by the slightest change in their tone. "Is the king often in these rooms?" "Less often than he should be." Hilda stopped by a door and finally turned around. "Don't ask unnecessary questions about His Majesty, girl. And if you happen to meet him, don't stare at him for too long. He doesn't like it." Thea remembered the warning, but gave it little thought. What servant girl would stand around staring at a king? She had more important things to worry about: making beds, cleaning fireplaces, and carrying meals to the court ladies who dined in the smaller hall before sunset. Their meeting happened on the 3rd day, and it happened nothing like the fateful encounters sung about in village songs. Thea was carrying a stack of fresh linens through the gallery, hurrying to finish before the bell rang for evening service, when a man came around the corner. He wore a plain riding cloak, no crown, no entourage, and had the expression of someone who had just been pulled away from important thoughts. She didn't move aside quickly enough. Her shoulder brushed his elbow, and the top sheet slipped from the stack and fell onto the stone floor. "I'm sorry," she breathed, bending to retrieve it. And then the air around them changed. It felt like the moment before lightning strikes during a storm, when the hairs on your arms rise and the taste of metal fills your mouth. Thea froze, her hand still inches from the fallen sheet, and looked up simply to understand where the strange sensation was coming from. The man was staring at her, as though he had seen a ghost. A moment earlier, his eyes had held the mild irritation of a man who had been bumped into in a corridor. Now, there was something entirely different in them. Recognition, mingled with horror, followed by an anger so pure and sudden that Thea instinctively took a step back, forgetting all about the fallen linen. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and taut as a bowstring drawn before the shot. "Thea, you're..." She didn't know how to address a stranger, dressed more simply than most courtiers, but something in his bearing revealed the truth, even before one of the guards by the distant doorway bowed his head. "Your Majesty." She could see him fighting himself, the way a man might fight the instinct to jerk his hand away from a flame, while his mind demanded that he first understand what was happening. His nostrils flared, as though he were trying, and failing, to stop himself from breathing in the air around her. Thea didn't understand the nature of the pull between them, but she could feel it. Something had happened, something far greater than a simple collision in a palace corridor, and whatever it was, it frightened the king more than it frightened her. "You're the new servant girl." It wasn't a question. "My 3rd day, Your Majesty." "Who hired you?" "Mistress Hilda, Your Majesty. I didn't mean to..." "Silence!" The word cracked like a whip. Thea closed her mouth, though everything inside her tightened at the unfairness of it. She had done nothing more than drop a sheet, yet he was looking at her as though she had set the palace on fire. Gideon stepped closer, and she saw that there was more than anger in his eyes. There was something that looked almost like pain. Old pain, polished over the years until it gleamed like hatred. "How dare you wear that face?" he whispered, and there was more venom in the whisper than there could have been in any shout. "I don't understand what you mean," Thea said quietly but firmly. Fear warred with the stubbornness she had inherited from her mother, a woman who had spent her entire life bending her back before her betters, yet had never allowed them to take the last thing she possessed, her dignity. I was born in the Verdun Valley. I have no other face but this one. Something flickered across his expression, as though her answer had caught him off guard, as though he had expected tears or pleading, and instead received calm defiance. But the fire in his eyes did not fade. "Helda," he called, without taking his gaze from Thea. The housekeeper appeared almost instantly, as though she had been waiting just around the corner. "Your Majesty?" "Move this girl to the far wing. The laundry, the kitchens, anywhere, as long as I don't have to see her in these corridors again." Helda gave Thea a quick glance filled with questions, but offered no protest. "As you command, Your Majesty." Gideon turned so sharply that his cloak snapped through the air and strode away without looking back, leaving Thea standing among the scattered linens, her cheeks burning with humiliation, and a completely incomprehensible feeling lodged somewhere deep in her chest, as though she had just lost something she had never possessed. Helda helped her gather the sheets. "What did I do wrong?" Thea asked, when the king's footsteps had faded into the depths of the gallery. "Nothing, girl," Helda sighed, and for the first time in 3 days, something resembling pity entered her voice. "You simply happen to have the wrong face." "What does that mean?" "It means you'll be lucky if the king forgets your name by next week." The housekeeper took Thea by the arm. "Come on, I'll take you to the laundry women. At least no one there will look at you as though you've risen from the grave." Thea followed her, clutching the stack of linens to her chest. All the way there, she tried to understand 2 things at once: why the king had looked at her with such hatred, and why, despite that hatred, some part of her still felt a strange, inexplicable pull toward him, as though an invisible thread had stretched between them at the exact moment the sheet fell to the floor. She decided it was simply fear. For now, she had no other explanation. Chapter 2. The laundry greeted Thea with clouds of steam and the rhythmic thud of wooden paddles against wet cloth. Here, the air smelled of lye soap rather than wax. No one expected her to bow when she entered, and within a week, Thea decided she liked her new post far better than the galleries of the West Wing. The head laundress was named Greta, a woman whose hands were reddened from hot water and whose tongue was as sharp as any market vendor's. "Don't be afraid of hard work, and they'll like you here," she told Thea on her very first day. "If you are afraid of it, go back to the nobles. They like people who are afraid." Thea liked that advice far better than Helda's warning. She threw herself into the work the same way she always had at home, without complaining, without scheming, and without trying to make her own burden lighter by shifting it onto someone else. By the end of the 2nd week, Greta was already trusting her with the finest fabrics, the ones that could not be placed in unskilled hands. Of all the laundresses, Thea became closest to Mila, a girl her own age with a quick laugh and an uncanny ability to find something amusing, even in the dullest task. "They say you ran straight into the king himself," Mila said one day as they hung sheets in the inner courtyard, where clotheslines stretched between stone pillars like a spider's web. "Is it true he practically growled at you?" "He didn't growl." Thea smoothed the crease from the fabric. "He just looked at me as though I'd stolen something from him." "Do you really look that much like her? The woman who ran away with a southern lord right before the wedding?" Thea froze. It was the first time she had heard any explanation for what had happened in the corridor. "Like who?" "Lady Aylin." Mila lowered her voice, even though there was no one else in the courtyard. "She was supposed to marry the king about 5 years ago. Everyone said the wedding was just days away. Her dowry was already being brought in from the southern lands. Then, one night, she disappeared with a man she'd met at the spring fair. They say the king hasn't looked at another woman for more than a few moments since. And then you appear with her face." "It's my face," Thea said more sharply than she intended. She immediately softened when she saw Mila draw back. I'm sorry. I'm just tired of having to explain that ever since my first day. No one's saying it isn't yours, Mila replied soothingly. At least now you know why he was so furious. She understood now, but that didn't make it any easier. All evening, Thea turned what she had heard over in her mind, trying to reconcile her anger at the injustice of it with her sympathy for a man who had been betrayed at one of the most important moments of his life. She knew the cost of betrayal firsthand. Her father had abandoned her and her mother when Thea was 7, and she still remembered how long it had taken before her mother could say his name without a tremor in her voice. Perhaps the king's tremor had simply turned to ice. The days passed and became weeks, and Thea settled into her new routine. Dawn in the laundry, midday delivering clean linens throughout the castle. Evenings spent mending and darning in the small room beside the kitchen that she shared with 3 other girls. She never saw the king. Not once since that morning in the gallery, and that suited her perfectly well. Gideon was far less content. He told himself he had forgotten the incident in the corridor by the very next day. He repeated that to himself for 2 weeks, every time he caught himself thinking about the servant girl with Aylin's face, but different eyes, dark instead of gray, and a different way of looking at him, direct rather than evasive. He had ordered her moved away precisely so that he could forget her. The order had been obeyed. Yet memory, it seemed, was far less willing to obey royal commands than his courtiers were. One evening, returning from the stables by way of a shortcut through the inner courtyard, he heard laughter. A quick, bright burst of feminine laughter, the kind usually followed by a joke rather than flattery. Gideon slowed without knowing why. 2 laundresses were hanging the last sheets of the day in the light of the setting sun. One of them was that girl. She hadn't noticed him. Her back was turned as she reached up toward the line, and there was nothing graceful in the practiced courtly sense about the simple movement, nothing calculated or affected. She was simply someone tired after a long day who could still find enough energy to laugh at a friend's joke. Gideon stood in the shadow of the archway far longer than a man with no reason to linger in the laundry courtyard should have. When he finally walked away, he was angrier with himself than he had been with her that first day in the corridor. It wasn't the face. He understood that much that evening, though he would never have admitted it, not even to himself. Aylin had never laughed like that, openly, until tears filled her eyes, without the slightest concern for who might hear. Aylin had measured every laugh the same way she had measured every glance from beneath her lashes. This girl simply laughed because something was funny. Gideon returned to his chambers in a foul mood and spent the evening sitting over papers he never truly read, staring into the fire far more often than at the letters from the Southern lords. His advisor, Morton, came in with a report on the kingdom's grain reserves and left having accomplished nothing. The king failed to answer a single question, and twice had to ask Morton to repeat what he had just said. Their next meeting came a week later, again entirely by accident. Thea was carrying a tray of dishes out of the small library, where she had been preparing a table for one of the court ladies' evening reading, when the door swung open before she had time to step aside. Gideon entered abruptly, lost in thought, and stopped just as suddenly as she did. This time, neither of them dropped anything. "Your Majesty?" Thea curtsied, lowering her gaze to the tray in her hands and trying not to reveal how quickly her heart had begun to beat. He remained silent longer than a simple greeting required. "You were moved to the laundry," he finally said. The old sharpness was gone from his voice. In its place was something almost like the awkwardness of a man who didn't quite understand why he had spoken at all. "Yes, Your Majesty, by your order." "Does it suit you there?" The question sounded so strange coming from the king who, only 2 weeks earlier, had ordered her out of his sight, that Thea instinctively looked up. He wasn't looking at her with anger now. There was something far more complicated in his expression, as though a battle was taking place inside him, and even he did not know which side would win. "I like it there, Your Majesty. Greta is a strict teacher, but she's fair." "Good," he repeated, as though he had no idea what to say next. For the first time, Thea noticed that without anger hardening his features, there was something weary about his face rather than merely arrogant. The look of a man carrying a burden that had long since grown too heavy for him. "Your Majesty," she curtsied again, "I need to deliver this tray before the tea grows cold." "Yes." He stepped aside to let her pass. And as Thea walked by him, she felt it again. That same sensation from the gallery, the pull, as though the air between them had tightened into a slender, invisible thread. This time, he didn't recoil. He didn't snap at her. He simply watched her walk away. Even after Thea stepped into the corridor, she could still feel his gaze between her shoulder blades, long after she had turned the corner. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings looked at servant girls for any number of reasons, and none of them were worth losing sleep over. And yet, sleep was a long time coming that night. And it wasn't the exhausting day's work that kept her awake. Chapter 3. Lady Irene of Dasser had arrived at the court of Urkal 3 years earlier, when her father, an impoverished but still influential lord of the eastern lands, brought his daughter to court with one clear purpose: to marry her to the king. Since then, Irene had mastered the court dances better than any other lady, learned to choose gowns that matched the colors of the royal banners, and made certain she was always near Gideon at feasts and council gatherings whenever propriety allowed. Gideon noticed her exactly as much as etiquette required, and not a second more. Irene learned about the incident in the gallery from her own maid, who had heard it from one of the guards, who in turn had heard it from Helda. The way all palace secrets traveled, passing from mouth to mouth, faster than fire through a dry forest. At first, Irene found the story little more than an amusing piece of gossip. The king had encountered a new servant girl and become angry because she reminded him of the bride who had run away from him. Interesting, perhaps. Nothing more. But then her maid mentioned one detail Irene could not get out of her mind. The guard at the door had said that, for a moment, the air in the gallery had seemed to thicken, like the air before a storm, and that 2 of his companions had felt the same thing, even though they had been standing 10 paces away. Irene knew enough of the old legends to understand what that meant. A true bond did not choose according to noble birth or purity of blood. It found whom it found, and it asked no one's permission. For 3 days, Irene tried to convince herself that the guard had been mistaken, that the rumors had been exaggerated, that it was impossible for a simple laundress to be the king's true mate, while she, after devoting 3 years of her life to winning his favor, was left with nothing. On the 4th day, she went down to the laundry under the pretense of inspecting the quality of the washing of the royal garments. As a lady of the court, she could make such visits without having to explain herself. She found Thea beside a vat of steaming water, her sleeves rolled up and her face flushed from the heat. One look was enough for Irene to understand why the guards in the gallery had been unsettled. It wasn't beauty. Thea was not extraordinarily beautiful, at least not in the way Irene herself was, trained to emphasize every flattering feature. It was something else. There was a directness in Thea's gaze that made one forget her humble origins and remember her face. "You're the new girl," Irene said as she approached, making an effort to sound casual. "I've been here 3 weeks, my lady." Thea gave an awkward curtsy, her hands still wet. "They say you ran into His Majesty in the gallery." Thea froze for a moment, but quickly regained her composure. It was a misunderstanding, my lady. I dropped some linen, that was all. That was all, Irene repeated, studying her so intently that Thea found the scrutiny more uncomfortable than the king's anger had been. Well, I hope you'll be more careful in the future. She left without another word, but Thea felt the chill of that conversation long afterward, as though someone had opened a door onto a winter courtyard in the middle of the warm laundry. Irene returned to her chambers and wept, not from grief, but from rage. It was the quiet, controlled kind of rage that builds over years and eventually demands release. For 3 years, she had endured Gideon's coldness, convincing herself that patience would eventually be rewarded. Sooner or later, the king would notice her devotion, her efforts, the place she had carefully maintained beside him at every reception. And now, all of it was threatened by a girl who did not even know what she had been given. Irene began with small things, the way people do when they have not yet decided whether they are ready to wage a real war. First, Thea's favorite shawl disappeared, the only keepsake she had left from her mother. Irene ordered her maid to steal it from the chest in the laundress's shared room and burn it in a distant hearth where no one would see. Thea cried for half the night, unable to understand what could have happened to the shawl she had guarded so carefully during the 3-week journey from her home village. Then came the rumors, carefully woven whispers, the kind impossible to disprove because no one could ever trace them back to their source. Word began spreading through the kitchens that the new laundress was stealing small coins from the pockets of noblemen's clothes sent down to be washed. Greta did not believe it for a moment. She knew her worker too well. But Helda, as senior housekeeper, felt obligated to conduct an inspection. Nothing was found. Still, the shadow of suspicion remained over Thea, like smoke lingering after a fire had been extinguished. "Someone has it in for you," Mila said one day as she helped Thea hang the laundry after another exhausting day. "Rumors like these don't start by themselves." "I haven't done anything to anyone," Thea replied, though deep down she already suspected the truth. She could not forget the way Irene had looked at her beside the washing vat. "Maybe someone's jealous because of what happened with the king." It was just a dropped sheet. "Drop sheets don't make Lady Irene of Dasser come down to the laundry in person," Mila pointed out. Thea had no answer to that. A week later came the third incident, and the worst so far. Thea was accused of ruining an expensive tapestry that had been sent for cleaning from the private chambers of a noble guest. The fabric had been drenched in ink so thoroughly that there was no possibility of calling it an accident. Thea swore she had not touched the tapestry after leaving it to dry, but a servant's word carried little weight against that of a court lady who claimed she had seen Thea near the chest containing the tapestry the previous evening. The matter might have ended in a whipping or a dismissal, if not for chance. That day, Gideon happened to be crossing the servants' courtyard, an unusual occurrence in itself, as the king came there perhaps once every few months, and found the dispute already in full swing. Helda stood there looking both angry and uncertain. The noblewoman was demanding immediate punishment, and Thea stood pale but dry-eyed, repeating the same words over and over. She had not touched the tapestry. "What is going on?" Gideon asked. The entire courtyard fell silent at once. Helda explained the situation, and as Gideon listened, he found himself watching Thea. Watching the way she kept her back straight, despite the fear betrayed by the white knuckles of her clenched fists. Aelin would have dissolved into tears in her place. She would have begged for mercy and appealed to his sympathy. This girl remained silent and waited for justice, not mercy. "Do you have a witness who can confirm that you didn't go near the chest after leaving the tapestry?" he asked her directly. "Greta saw me washing all evening, Your Majesty. I never left the vats, not even for a moment." Greta was summoned, and she confirmed every word without hesitation. Gideon looked at the lady who had made the accusation, a young lady in waiting close to Irene, though he did not yet know of that connection. And something in the way her eyes darted away told him more than any evidence could have. "This matter is settled," he said curtly. "The servant will return to her duties, and anyone who makes accusations without evidence would do well to be more careful with their own reputation in the future." He left almost as quickly as he had appeared. But before he turned away, Thea caught his gaze. There was not a trace of his former hatred in it. There was something else instead, something heavy and intent, as though for the first time he was seeing not the shadow of the woman who had betrayed him, but a person standing her ground despite everything being turned against her. Irene, watching the entire scene from an upstairs window, clenched her teeth until her jaw ached. Petty tricks had failed. It was time to think of something more serious. Chapter 4. Autumn came early to Urkal that year, bringing weeks of relentless rain and a wave of sickness that swept through the palace servants one by one. Greta was the first of the laundresses to fall ill, followed by 2 others, leaving Thea to shoulder twice her usual workload as she rushed between the steaming vats and the drying courtyard, where the sun barely showed itself anymore. Gideon did not escape the illness either, though, unlike the servants, the king's condition was not something anyone was permitted to discuss. He came down with a fever after a long ride through the rain to the northern border, where he had gone to settle a dispute between 2 barons. For 3 days he remained confined to his chambers, while the court physician, an elderly man named Osbert, struggled to bring down the fever with herbal draughts and cold compresses. On the 4th day, Osbert himself fell ill. Helda found herself in a desperate position. The king needed constant care. But among the servants still on their feet were either inexperienced girls or people she did not trust enough to allow into the royal chambers. Then she remembered hearing that Thea's mother had been a village healer. "Do you know anything about herbs?" she asked directly when she found Thea in the laundry late that evening. "A little. My mother taught me while she was alive." "Then come with me. The king needs someone to care for him, and there's no one else." Thea froze. She remembered Gideon's expression that first day in the gallery, his cold command, the anger that had flared for reasons she had not understood. The thought of spending an entire night beside his bed frightened her more than any amount of hard labor. "Isn't there someone else, Mistress Helda?" "There's no time to look for someone else, girl. Either you come or the king spends the night unattended, and if something happens to him, you won't be the only one answering for it." There was no point arguing further. The royal chambers greeted Thea with the heavy, oppressive smell of sweat and fever, despite the window being slightly open. Gideon lay among tangled sheets, his breathing uneven, his forehead damp with perspiration. In the light of a single candle, his face looked younger and far more vulnerable than it ever did in public. Thea set to work exactly as her mother had taught her. She rebuilt the dying fire in the hearth, prepared a herbal infusion from the remedies she found in Osbert's cabinet, and replaced the damp bedding with dry sheets. Gideon drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering words she could not understand before sinking back into restless sleep. During one of the worst bouts of fever, he spoke a name. "Aelin." Thea froze, a damp cloth in her hands, staring at his face twisted with pain. She did not know whether there was any point comforting a delirious king, but something in his voice stopped her. There was no anger in it, only pain, raw and unguarded, the kind no one willingly reveals while fully conscious. Thea sat beside the bed and spoke softly, the same way her mother had once spoken to feverish villagers back home. "It will pass," she said. "The fever will break by morning." His eyes opened, clouded by illness, but for a brief moment he seemed to recognize her, not as Aelin, but as the woman sitting beside him now. "You won't leave?" he asked. There was nothing royal in his voice then. He sounded simply like a man who was afraid of being left alone. "I won't," Thea answered, surprised by how easily the promise came. The night passed slowly. She changed the compresses, gave him small sips of the herbal drink, and watched his breathing while trying to remember everything her mother had taught her. Toward dawn, the fever finally began to ease. Gideon fell into a calmer sleep than he had known during the previous 3 days, while Thea, utterly exhausted, dozed off in the chair beside his bed, still holding the cloth she had been using for the compresses. His voice woke her. This time it was clear, stripped of the strained confusion of fever. "You stayed here all night." Thea startled awake and straightened in the chair. Dawn had already begun gilding the edges of the curtains. "Mistress Helda sent me to care for you, Your Majesty. Your fever broke toward morning." Gideon pushed himself up onto one elbow, assessing his own condition with the surprise of a man who had expected to feel much worse. "You did this?" "Willow bark and elderflower. My mother always used them for fevers." He was silent for a while, studying her so intently that Thea became uncomfortable and began gathering the bowls and cups simply to give her hands something to do. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly. Thea turned, unsure she had heard him correctly.
"For what, Your Majesty?" "For that day in the gallery." He was not looking at her but toward the window instead, as though the confession was easier if he did not have to meet her eyes. "I treated you unfairly. You don't owe a servant an explanation for your orders." "No, I don't." He finally looked at her directly. "But I'll give you one anyway, if you'll allow me." Thea nodded, though everything in her told her that this kind of openness between a king and a laundress was unheard of and dangerous in its own right. He told her about Aelin. Not everything, but enough. 5 years earlier, he had brought his bride from the southern lands and prepared for the wedding, believing he had found the woman who would share both his throne and his life. Then, one spring night, she disappeared with a wandering lord she had met only a month earlier at a fair, leaving behind nothing but a letter filled with apologies that excused nothing. "For 5 years, I couldn't look at a woman without wondering whether she saw me or only my crown," he said quietly. "Then you ran into me in that corridor, wearing her face, and all the anger I'd been carrying came down on the first person within reach." He paused. "It was unfair. None of it was your fault." "I understand what betrayal can do to someone," Thea said after a moment. "My father left my mother and me when I was 7. For a long time, she couldn't even say his name without her voice trembling." Something softened in Gideon's expression. For the first time, perhaps, he saw her not as a reflection of his own wound, but as someone carrying a pain of her own, similar, yet entirely separate from his. "What was her name? Your mother?" "Rena." "Tell me about her." And Thea did. She told him about the village healer who had treated half their village with herbs and kind words, about evenings beside the hearth, about the songs Rena used to sing while her hands were busy with work. She told him how her mother had died that spring from a fever she had been unable to cure in herself. Gideon listened without interrupting, and for the first time in a long while, Thea found herself speaking about her mother without a knot tightening in her throat. Perhaps it was easier to tell these things to someone who had never known Rena, someone who could not remind Thea of what she had lost simply by looking at her. They spoke longer than propriety allowed between a king and a servant. When footsteps sounded outside the door, Helda coming to check on Gideon's condition, they both startled, as though they had been caught doing something forbidden. "Your Majesty, are you feeling better?" Helda asked as she entered. "Much better," Gideon replied. His voice had already regained its usual royal restraint.
though the look he gave Thea before she left the chambers was entirely different. Warm. Almost as though watching her leave was harder for him than it should have been. Thea returned to the laundry, carrying a feeling she did not entirely understand. The anger she had held since their first meeting had disappeared without a trace, leaving something far more complicated in its place. Pity, mingled with reluctant warmth, and a growing affection for a man who had been betrayed so cruelly 5 years earlier that he had built a wall of ice around himself. She told herself it was only sympathy. Anyone would feel sorry for the king after hearing his story. But at night, as she tried to fall asleep, she found herself thinking less and less about Aelin. Instead, she remembered the way his voice had sounded when he asked her not to leave, and how she herself had not wanted to go. Left alone, Gideon stared at the door long after Thea had disappeared behind it, fighting the urge to follow her under some ridiculous excuse. For 5 years, he had forbidden himself such impulses. He had trained himself to see calculation in every smile and a trap behind every kind word. But this girl had asked for nothing in return for caring for him. She had not tried to use a night at the king's bedside to bargain for privileges or favor. And somehow, that frightened him more than any scheme ever could. He summoned a servant and gave an order that seemed strange coming from a king who had only just recovered from a fever. Find out everything there was to know about a servant girl named Thea, and do it quietly, without attracting the attention of the court. He told himself it was merely a precaution. A king had every right to know who had been caring for him while he was ill. He barely believed that himself. Chapter 5. Rumors that a servant girl had spent the night at the sick king's bedside spread through the palace faster than the smell of smoke. Irene heard about it over breakfast from one of the ladies-in-waiting, who was repeating the gossip with the particular delight people took in sharing secrets that did not concern them personally. "She spent the entire night beside his bed," the young woman chirped as she spread honey over a slice of bread. "Helda says the king himself asked her to stay." Irene listened in silence, feeling that familiar, carefully restrained fire begin to burn inside her once again. A little over a month had passed since the incident with the tapestry, and during that time, Irene had managed to convince herself that the small cruelties would teach the girl a lesson, frighten her enough to keep her away from the king. But the fever had proved the opposite. Instead of being pushed farther away, the servant had somehow drawn even closer, into the very heart of the royal chambers, beside the king's bed, into a place Irene herself had never been allowed to enter in all her 3 years at court. She decided she needed to see the truth with her own eyes. The opportunity came during the autumn harvest reception, when Gideon, contrary to his habits of recent years, lingered in the West Wing longer than necessary. Officially, he was checking on the restoration of the tapestries after the recent incident. But anyone watching him closely enough could see that the tapestries were not the true reason he stayed. Irene followed at a respectful distance, and what she saw confirmed every one of her worst fears. Thea stood near a window with a basket of freshly washed linens. When Gideon found her there, he did not issue a cold command or turn away as he would have done a month earlier. Instead, he stopped beside her. They began to talk. Irene could not hear the words, but she saw enough. There was an ease between them, no strain, none of the rigid distance that usually marked the king's dealings with servants. At one point, Thea said something that made Gideon smile. Truly smile. It was the kind of smile Irene had never once seen on his face during all 3 years she had spent at court. She stepped back into the shadow of a column, her hands curling into fists until her nails dug into her palms. That very night, unable to sleep, Irene went to the only person who could give her what beauty, title, and patience had all failed to provide. Old Moret lived on the outskirts of the capital, and was known among noblewomen not so much for beauty herbs as for entirely different kinds of remedies, one spoken of only in whispers. "I need something," Irene said, without wasting time on pleasantries. Mirette, accustomed to visits of this kind, merely raised an eyebrow. "What sort of something, my lady?" "Something that will make a person seriously ill. Not kill them, but frighten them. Keep them bedridden for a long time." Something shifted in the old woman's expression. Not disgust, calculation. The expression of someone who had long ago stopped asking unnecessary questions when the price was right. "There is such a remedy, but if the dose is even slightly too strong, then so be it," Irene cut her off. Even she had not expected her own voice to sound so cold. She took the small vial of dark liquid, hid it in the folds of her cloak, and returned to the palace before dawn. Her heart was pounding, not from fear, but anticipation. For the first time in months, she felt as though she was in control again, rather than someone forced to stand aside and watch another woman's happiness unfold before her. Only one difficulty remained. She had to get close enough to Thea without drawing suspicion toward herself. The answer presented itself 2 days later, when Irene noticed Mila, Thea's friend, carrying a tray of hot, spiced wine for the palace guests. It was a simple duty any laundress might be given during a large reception, if the regular servants were short-handed. And Mila, Irene had noticed, was jealous. Not openly, but clearly enough for anyone who knew how to watch. The recent attention Thea had received had not gone unnoticed by her friend. Once, without realizing Irene was within earshot, Mila had complained to another laundress. "Some people have all the luck. First, the king gets a fever, then the king starts smiling, while the rest of us just keep washing and washing." Jealousy was useful, easy to notice, and once noticed, easy to exploit. Irene's plan came together over the course of a single night, clear and cold as a winter sky. She would wait until Thea was serving the king a drink at the next reception. She would switch the goblet. Then she would leave enough evidence to point toward Mila, whose jealousy was already known to half the kitchen staff. A note, written in another hand, could be hidden among Mila's belongings. The vial, supposedly used to poison the drink, could be planted there as well. All Irene had to do was wait for the right opportunity. It came sooner than expected. A week later, Gideon announced a small reception to celebrate the conclusion of negotiations with the northern barons. And, as the entire court soon learned, girls from the laundry would be helping serve the guests. When Irene heard the news, she smiled. For the first time in a long while, she felt something close to satisfaction. Fate itself seemed to be moving in her favor. Chapter 6. The small hall had been prepared for the reception since early morning, and Thea, along with the other laundresses, helped arrange the goblets and spread the tablecloths, trying not to think about the fact that this evening, for the first time in a month, she would be near Gideon, in full view of the entire court, rather than in the privacy of an empty corridor or the laundry. Over the past few weeks, something fragile and unspoken had begun to grow between them. Brief conversations in passing, glances that lingered a little longer than they should, and a concern for her that he no longer tried to hide behind a mask of indifference. Once, he had sent her a basket of apples from the southern orchard, telling the servant who delivered it that the harvest had been particularly good that year, and it would be a shame not to share. Thea understood that gestures like these from a king toward an ordinary servant could not go unnoticed.
Yet what frightened her in secret was not so much the gossip as her own heart, which seemed to beat faster at the mere thought of seeing him again. She had not yet admitted to herself that she was in love, but something warm and cautious inside her had long since grown beyond simple sympathy for a king wounded by fate. That evening, when the hall filled with guests, Thea and 3 other girls carried trays of warmed wine, keeping to the shadows along the walls as Helda had taught them. Servants were meant to remain invisible until they were needed. Gideon sat at the head of the table, listening to one of the barons report on the condition of the northern roads. Yet his gaze kept finding Thea among the servants moving through the hall. Each time their eyes met, something in his expression softened for the briefest moment before he returned his attention to the conversation.
Irene watched those glances from the opposite end of the table, her rage carefully concealed behind a flawless smile. It demanded an outlet. The moment came near the end of the reception, when the guests, relaxed by wine and the warmth of the fireplaces, stopped paying as much attention to the movement of the servants as they had earlier in the evening. Taking advantage of a brief moment of confusion at a side table where Mila was pouring fresh wine from a pitcher, Irene quietly switched 2 goblets on a tray prepared for the king. One was intended for Gideon. The other was supposed to be taken back toward the kitchen by Thea so she could taste it and make sure it had not cooled too much, as required by the traditional tasting procedure before wine was served to important guests. Irene had miscalculated only one thing. She believed the poisoned goblet was meant for the king. In reality, the serving procedure that evening had changed. Knowing about the tasting tradition, Gideon had, for the first time in years, insisted that his wine be served without anyone tasting it beforehand. He had told Helda that he trusted his servants and had no desire to humiliate them with unnecessary suspicion. Helda had not dared argue with the king and passed the instruction along. But not everyone had heard about the change in time. Thea, unaware of the new order, lifted the tasting goblet to her lips, the very one Irene had switched, intending an entirely different victim. For the first few seconds, nothing happened. Then, an unnatural cold burned through her throat, as though she had swallowed snow mixed with flame, and the entire hall seemed to tilt sideways. "Thea?" Mila's voice reached her as though from a great distance, muffled and stretched thin. The goblet slipped from Thea's fingers and shattered against the stone floor. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the suddenly quiet hall, an instant before Thea collapsed beside it, her legs giving way beneath her. Gideon rose so violently that his chair overturned behind him. "Thea!" He reached her before most of the guests had even understood what was happening. Dropping to his knees beside her, he lifted her limp body into his arms. In that moment, the entire court and every rule of distance between king and servant ceased to matter. Thea's face had gone deathly pale, almost blue. Her breathing was shallow and ragged, and her half-open eyes recognized nothing around her. "A physician!" Gideon shouted. His voice broke in a way it never had before, not in council, not even in battle. "Now!" The hall erupted into chaos. Guests retreated toward the walls, whispering among themselves. Guards blocked the doors.
The new court physician, a young but capable man named Roland, who had taken over from the still ailing Osbert, was already pushing his way through the crowd with his medical bag in hand. "What did she drink?" Roland asked, kneeling beside Gideon and examining Thea's pale face. "Wine from the tasting goblet," Mila said, her voice shaking as she still clutched the pitcher. She was only tasting it, like she always does." Roland smelled the fragments of the broken goblet a guard handed him. His expression darkened. "Poison. From the scent, black nightshade root, mixed with something else. We need to make her vomit immediately, or she won't survive until morning." The next several minutes blurred into one endless nightmare for Gideon. Roland worked quickly and skillfully, forcing Thea to expel the poisoned wine before making her swallow bitter antidotal drafts.
Gideon held her head in his lap the entire time, whispering words he would not remember afterward. Promises, pleas, confessions he never would have dared speak aloud if she had been conscious. "Don't you dare leave me," he repeated again and again, stroking the sweat-damp hair away from her forehead. "Do you hear me? Don't you dare." They carried her to a sick room beside the physician's wing. Roland fought for her life throughout the night, while Gideon refused to leave her bedside, canceling every matter of state, every meeting, every duty of kingship that on any other night would have seemed urgent. By dawn, the fever began to ease. Her breathing steadied. Roland wiped the sweat from his forehead and finally spoke the words Gideon had waited all night to hear, too afraid even to give voice to the hope himself. "She'll live, Your Majesty. The worst is over." Gideon closed his eyes. Something inside him that had held itself together through the entire night by sheer force of will finally allowed itself to tremble. He lowered his head to the edge of the bed beside Thea's limp hand and remained there for a long time, unable to move, as though the slightest motion might disturb the fragile balance that had returned her to life. That night, he finally understood what he had refused to admit throughout all the previous weeks. He was not merely drawn to a woman who wore Aylin's face. He loved Thea. Thea herself, her honesty, her kindness, her laughter that sought nothing in return, her courage in the face of injustice, and the thought that he might have lost her before ever telling her any of it tore through him more deeply than any wound he had ever suffered in battle. The investigation began before Thea even regained consciousness. The captain of the guard, a stern man named Darius, who had served the crown since Gideon's father's reign, approached the matter with the same methodical precision he brought to every palace investigation. Mila's quarters were searched first, since she had been pouring the wine that evening. Unfortunately for the frightened girl, the search produced evidence that seemed damning. Inside the chest containing her belongings, the guards found an empty poison vial and a torn piece of a note written in an unfamiliar, deliberately awkward hand. The message promised that she would soon be rid of her rival for the king's attention. Mila was placed under guard that very night, despite her desperate protests and tears. Greta and half the laundry staff were ready to swear that Mila would never hurt a fly, much less poison her closest friend. But Darius was experienced enough not to rush to judgment. Something about the case troubled him from the beginning. Everything fit together too neatly.
The evidence had fallen into their hands too conveniently, almost as though someone had deliberately made sure the investigation would not take long.
"Who found the vial in the chest first?" he asked the guard who had conducted the search. "One of the ladies in waiting, Captain. Lady Irene insisted on being present during the search herself. She said she wished to make certain the investigation was conducted fairly." Darius fell silent. A noblewoman personally insisting on attending the search of a servant's belongings was not unheard of, but it was unusual enough to trouble an experienced captain. His suspicion deepened the following day when one of the younger maids, trembling with fear that she would be punished for staying silent for so long, finally came forward. Several weeks earlier, she had seen Lady Irene leaving the home of old Merritt, the healer on the outskirts of the city who was known for questionable remedies.
Ever since then, the maid had been tormented by her conscience, uncertain whether she should tell anyone. "Why did you remain silent until now?" Darius asked sternly. "I was afraid, Captain. Lady Irene is a noblewoman, and I'm only a maid. Who would have believed me?" Darius believed her. Too many pieces had begun to form a single picture. Irene's jealousy, her years of failed attempts to win the king's attention, her visit to a suspicious healer, her conveniently timed presence during the search of Mila's quarters. A search of Irene's own rooms was ordered personally by Gideon after Darius informed him of his suspicions that same evening. It produced the final proof. Hidden in a secret compartment of Irene's jewelry box was a second vial, identical to the kind Merritt used for such potions. And beside it was a draft of the very note that had been planted in Mila's chest, a draft Irene had forgotten to destroy in her haste. When Gideon was informed of the discovery, he remained silent for a long time, staring at the vial and the scrap of paper lying on the desk before him. A cold anger spread through his chest. It was nothing like the violent bursts of rage he had known in earlier years. "Bring her to me," he said at last, "and release the girl from custody. Immediately."
Chapter 7. Irene was brought into the throne room shortly before noon, and from a single look at her face, pale yet still held proudly high, Gideon knew she had already heard about what had been discovered in her chambers. "Your Majesty," she began, bowing, "I don't understand what—" "Don't bother." He cut her off in the same icy tone he had once used with Thea on the first day they met. Only now that coldness was directed at someone who truly deserved it. "The vial found in your chambers is identical to the ones the healer Merit uses to prepare her poisons. The draft of the note is in your handwriting. My scribes have already compared it with the petitions you submitted to the treasury. A maid saw you leaving the healer's house several weeks before the reception. It's too late to deny it, Irene." She remained silent for a long moment, and Gideon watched the pride in her eyes slowly give way to despair. Not remorse, but the despair of someone whose plan had failed, rather than the regret of someone who truly understood her guilt. 3 years, she finally said, her voice trembling for the first time that morning. "For 3 years I stood beside you, Your Majesty. Every reception, every council meeting, every ceremony, I was there, beside you, and you never even noticed me. Then that servant girl appeared 3 months ago and received what I spent years trying to earn. What you call my attention was never something you could earn through effort, Irene." Gideon spoke evenly, without anger, and somehow that wounded her more deeply than shouting would have. A true bond cannot be bargained for with years of devotion. Either it exists or it doesn't. You spent 3 years pursuing something that could never happen, and instead of accepting that, you chose to kill an innocent woman. "I didn't want her to die," Irene breathed. "I only wanted to frighten her, make her leave." "You put poison into a goblet, without even knowing for certain what dose would kill and what dose would merely frighten someone." Gideon's voice became as heavy as stone. "You framed an innocent girl, and were willing to make her pay with her freedom and perhaps her life for your jealousy. You nearly killed the woman I love." It was the first time he had spoken those final words aloud, and they echoed through the empty hall with a force that surprised even him. Irene lowered her head. "What will happen to me?" Gideon had spent the entire night considering that question, weighing his fury against reason. Part of him wanted to punish her with the full severity of the law, but he also understood that executing a noblewoman, deserved or not, could provoke unrest among the Eastern lords, whose alliance remained important to the stability of the crown in uncertain times. "You will be stripped of your title and all your lands," he said. "You will be exiled to the northern territories, to the fortress of Haldwyn, where you will spend the rest of your life under the supervision of its garrison. This is not mercy, Irene. It is the only thing keeping me from putting you on trial for an attempt on the life of the crown through my true mate, and such a trial would end far worse for you." She had no answer. The guards took her away that same day, and by evening a carriage with barred windows was already traveling north, carrying the former lady-in-waiting away from the court she had tried so desperately to conquer. Thea regained consciousness on the 3rd day after the poisoning. She awoke in an unfamiliar room filled with soft evening light and the scents of herbs and wax, reminding her of home, of her mother, of a time before illness had taken away everything she loved. The first thing she saw when she opened her eyes was Gideon's face. He looked exhausted, dark circles beneath his eyes, as though he had not slept for days.
He leaned over her bed, wearing an expression she had never seen on his face before. Thea. He said her name as though he feared the sound itself might frighten her away, shattering her fragile return to life. Can you hear me? Your Majesty? Her voice barely worked, her throat painfully dry. What happened? You were poisoned. He took her hand in both of his, and Thea felt his fingers trembling. She had never before seen this man betray weakness of any kind. At the reception, the tasting goblet, someone poisoned the wine. Her memories slowly returned. The hall, the goblet, the cold burning in her throat, faces blurring before her eyes. Mila, she whispered, remembering the last thing she had seen before losing consciousness. She was pouring the wine. Mila had nothing to do with it, he answered quickly. She was framed. Irene of Dasser was responsible. She has already been exiled to the north. Thea closed her eyes, trying to make sense of everything she had just heard. Then she felt Gideon gently lift her hand to his lips and kiss her knuckles with a tenderness she never would have expected from the cold, arrogant king she had first met in that gallery. I thought I was going to lose you, he said quietly, his voice trembling for the first time since she had awakened. All that night, while Roland fought to keep you alive, I could think of only one thing, that I had never told you the truth, that I let anger and old wounds stand between us instead of admitting what I already understood the night you stayed beside me during my fever. What truth? Thea asked, though something inside her already knew the answer, warm and frightening at once. That I love you. He said it simply, without embellishment, looking directly into her eyes. Not Aylin's shadow, not some memory of betrayal. You, Thea. Your honesty, the way you weren't afraid to stand up to me even on the first day we met. Your kindness, which you never lost despite everything you suffered because of me and Irene's jealousy. Your laughter, which I heard in the laundry courtyard long before I dared admit to myself that I missed it every day I couldn't hear it. Thea remained silent as tears filled her eyes, not from pain, but from an emotion too overwhelming to fit into simple words. Forgive me, he continued, for that day in the gallery, for the coldness you never deserved, for making you endure months of distrust and suspicion instead of protecting you from the beginning, as I should have. Your Majesty. No, Gideon interrupted before she could finish. No more titles between you and me. Please, speak to me openly, as yourself. But please, Thea, grant at least that much to a man who is hopelessly in love with you. All right, she said softly, but you have nothing to ask forgiveness for.
You saw the face of the woman who betrayed you, and you were afraid to trust again. I can understand that.
Understanding something doesn't mean excusing it, he replied. You deserved better from me from the very first day, not only after nearly dying in front of me.
Thea pushed herself higher against the pillows, wincing at the weakness that still gripped her body after the poison. Gideon immediately moved to help her, supporting her with a gentleness one would hardly expect from a man accustomed to commanding armies. I have something to confess too, she said, once she had gathered enough strength to speak. During those first weeks, I hated you for being so cold to me. Then I pitied you after learning about Aylin. But that night when I sat beside you during your fever, I realized pity had stopped being the only thing I felt for you a long time ago.
Gideon looked at her, with hope mingled with the disbelief of a man who had spent too many years refusing to believe such words could ever be meant sincerely. And what do you feel now? I don't know if I'm ready to call it by the word you just used, Thea answered honestly. Too much has happened over these past months, too much pain, too much fear. But I do know that I don't want you to leave this room. I know your voice calling my name was the first thing I heard when I came back to life, and I don't think that means nothing. He leaned toward her slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away if she wished. Then he kissed her. Carefully, tenderly. He poured into that kiss everything he had been unable to express in words. The terror of losing her, the relief that she was alive, and the love he no longer intended to hide behind coldness and pride. Thea kissed him back, feeling the tension that had built between them over so many months finally begin to ease. Not disappearing all at once, but like a long-awaited breath after holding it for far too long. "Stay with me," he whispered, drawing back only far enough to see her face. "Not as a servant, not secretly, not hidden in the shadows. Stay as who you are, by right of blood and heart. My true mate, my queen, if that is what you want." "That's too fast," Thea said, though her heart was beating in complete disagreement with her words. "Give me time. Time to know you not only as a king fighting the ghosts of his past, but as the man I might choose to share my future with." "As much time as you need," he answered without hesitation. "I waited 5 years before I could trust someone again. I can wait a little longer to earn your trust in return." Thea's recovery took almost a month, and throughout that time, Gideon visited her every day, ignoring the protests of advisors who considered such attention from a king toward a common servant improper. He no longer hid his feelings. He brought her books from the library, knowing she enjoyed reading in the evenings. He ordered the gardeners to plant southern apple trees outside her window, the same kind whose fruit he had sent her before ever confessing how he felt. And he found time for long conversations in which they slowly came to know one another not as king and servant, but simply as two people whose lives had unexpectedly been woven together by fate. Mila, fully cleared of all accusations and restored to her position, became a frequent visitor at her friend's bedside, bringing news from the laundry and making Thea laugh with stories about Greta's latest quirks and her relentless strictness toward inexperienced girls just beginning their service. When Helda learned about the king's confession, she merely shook her head with a smile. One day, she admitted that she had suspected the truth from the very beginning, from the moment she saw the way Gideon's expression changed when he first looked at the new servant girl in the gallery. The court gradually accepted the news of the king's true bond, though there was no shortage of gossip among the noble families who had once hoped for a royal marriage that would benefit them politically. But Gideon, having finally found what he had been denied for 5 long years, had no intention of sacrificing his happiness for anyone else's ambitions. Eventually, the court accepted the inevitable, especially as Thea's kindness and sense of fairness quickly won over those who took the time to know her. Winter gave way to early spring. One evening, while walking with Thea through the very garden Gideon had ordered planted for her, he stopped beneath a flowering branch and looked at her the way he had on the day of their first meeting in the gallery. Only now, there was no anger in his gaze. There was only warmth, built over long months of slow and careful closeness. "I promised to give you time," he said, "and I have no intention of rushing you now. But I want you to know something. My heart made its choice the moment I thought I might lose you, and it hasn't changed its mind for a single day since." Thea looked at him and remembered the cold, arrogant king from the gallery, the man who had seen only the ghost of his past when he looked at her. Then she looked at the man standing before her now, the man who had learned to trust again, the man who had sat beside her bed night after night, the man who asked for her opinion before making decisions that concerned them both, the man who had never once demanded anything she was not ready to give. "I've been thinking about it all winter," she said softly. "About who you were that first day and who you are now. About how afraid I was to fall in love with a man who hated me at first. And then about how I realized I already loved you long before I was brave enough to admit it, even to myself." "And what did you decide?" he asked. There was the same uncertainty in his voice that she had heard on the day she awakened, as though even now, after everything they had endured, he could not quite bring himself to believe he knew her answer. Thea smiled. It was the same open smile that had once made Gideon stop in the shadow of an archway and watch her from afar, unable to admit even to himself why he was so fascinated by her. "I decided I'm ready to become your wife, Gideon."
Not because fate bound us as true mates, but because over these months, I've come to know the man I truly want to love, with all his wounds, all his strength, and all his capacity to learn how to trust again. He pulled her into his arms. Their second kiss beneath the flowering apple trees held none of the careful hesitation of the first. It carried a promise sealed not merely by the true bond between them, but by months of patience, trust, and a love that had grown slowly enough to become stronger than any betrayal from the past. The wedding was set for midsummer, when the southern apple trees planted beneath the windows of the physician's wing were expected to bear fruit for the first time, a symbol not lost on courtiers accustomed to searching for signs of fate in every small detail. As Thea prepared for the ceremony, she often thought of her mother and wished Rena had lived long enough to see this day.
But she found comfort in believing that somewhere in another world, the healer from the Verdant Valley was surely happy for her daughter, who had found what Rena herself had lost so many years before. A love built not on calculation or advantage, but on truly seeing and knowing one another. And Gideon, watching his bride laugh with Mila and Greta in the castle courtyard on one of the last warm evenings before the wedding, thought that 5 years of loneliness and ice had been worth enduring if they had ultimately led him to the woman whose laughter had become the greatest gift fate had given him throughout all the years of his reign. The palace of Urkhal had witnessed many royal weddings over its long history, but never before had it seen a union that began with such coldness and ended in such genuine, hard-won love. And those who attended the summer ceremony in the garden among the flowering apple trees would remember that day for years to come as the beginning of a new and brighter age for the crown of Urkhal. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story. What would you have done if you were in Thea's place? Would you have been able to forgive someone who hated you at first sight once you learned the whole truth? Or would you have walked away from his life forever, despite your love for him, especially given the difference in your social status? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what you think. See you again soon. With love, Karina and Mia.